And from a medical perspective, is abortion considered a trauma? Like, is from like I guess like the medical community?
Yeah, so to understand how the psychological world views abortion as a trauma or not, you have to look at the history a little bit. Going back to the 1970s in terms of how abortion was viewed from 1973 when it was legalized to the feminist movement. At that time, uh, women were finally validated for their trauma from sex abuse. That was the first time in history that women were validated for PTSD right after Vietnam vets. At that time, men were perceived as perpetrators of females' trauma because of women being validated for that sex abuse issue around the 70s. That was right around the same time that men lost their rights around abortion legally. So from the 1970s on, the issue of abortion as a trauma, in terms of how men were viewed, they viewed men as perpetrators of females' trauma, not victims of trauma. And that holds today. So when we talk about the trauma with men in abortion, men are perceived as perpetrators. Now, in terms of how women are viewed as, is it legitimate trauma for females when they've had an abortion? Around 2009, the American Psychological Association did their own research, and they wanted to see, is it really traumatic for women who've had abortions? Do they actually have like PTSD symptoms? And through their research, what they found was that it was not more traumatic for a woman to have an abortion than a woman to have an unplanned pregnancy and carry the baby to term. So there was no difference, they said. That it was just
Okay.
as traumatic to have an unplanned pregnancy and carry it to term. So that was their 2009 research. Well, if you know anything about the American Psychological Association, they're pretty far left in terms of their leanings. They're very liberal. They're influenced by the feminist movement. And so at that point, they still stand on that research that it is not traumatic for a woman to go through an abortion, no more than if they carried the baby to term that was unplanned. So that's where they stand. Now, to add to what we were talking about earlier, is the psychological world does not view abortion as a trauma, also because the pro life world has been the ones primarily treating abortion as a potential trauma. So there's,
Why is that?
well, basically, because the mental health world was influenced by that research, by the far left, the mental health world never took it up as this is something that we need to ask when clients come into counseling. This is something that we need to treat professionally. This is something we need to do research on. So they basically left it to the pro life world and they perceived it as a religious, political kind of issue versus a actual mental health issue.